At the end of this month, parts of the 2018 Farm Bill are set to expire. But that would mean that many farmers won't see any federal dollars until President Trump's so-called Big Beautiful Bill.
This is not your ordinary farm crisis. We call it Farmageddon.
The American Midwest is holding its breath. Look closely at the heartland today. You see millions of acres of corn swaying in the wind, ripe for the harvest. But listen, do you hear that? Silence. No engines rumbling, no combines rolling, no trucks lining up at the weigh stations. The buyers have simply vanished. For generations, this soil was the engine of the global food supply. But today, shipments meant for China are stacked in limbo. Families who have worked the same land for over 100 years are watching their entire season and their legacy slip through their fingers. The grain is there, the capacity is there, but the money is gone. Now, look north. Just across the border, it is a completely different world. While American silos are overflowing with unsold inventory, Canada is moving at breakneck speed. They are locking in exclusive deals with Japan, South Korea, and the European Union. They are turning global attention their way. It is a brutal irony. American grain sits trapped in rotting silos, literally darkening in the rain, while Canadian shipments sail past them toward the very markets the U.S. used to dominate. How did this reversal happen so suddenly? How did the world's agricultural superpower lose its grip on the market in the span of a single season? This wasn't just bad luck, and it wasn't just the weather. What we are witnessing is the result of a calculated geopolitical shift, a perfect storm of self-inflicted tariff wounds, a logistical nightmare on the Mississippi River, and a sudden, devastating rejection of American biotechnology. While Washington was fighting a trade war, Canada was building a digital fortress. In this video, we are going to break down exactly how the U.S. was erased from the preferred supplier list and why the prairie trace system might just be the final nail in the coffin for the traditional American farm. The Midwest isn't just asleep, it's dying, and the executioner is economics. To understand the scale of this collapse, you have to look at the numbers. The destruction of the American Corn Belt didn't start in the fields. It started in Washington. The death blow was dealt long before the first kernel could even leave the docks. The catalyst was a decision that looked good on paper, but proved fatal in practice. When the White House imposed steep, punitive tariffs on Chinese-built cargo vessels, the intention was to punish Beijing. But in a globalized economy, the shockwave traveled backward, slamming directly into the country's agricultural core. Almost overnight, the cost of doing business skyrocketed. Shipping costs through the Gulf of Mexico, the primary artery for U.S. grain exports, surged by nearly 25%. Across the Pacific, the situation was even worse. Container rates doubled in a matter of weeks, hitting $5,000 per unit. This turned an already fragile post-pandemic market into a suffocating choke point. Farmers were suddenly paying a premium just to move their product off the farm, eating into margins that were razor-thin to begin with. But the logistical nightmare was just getting started. By March 2025, a second burden arrived, this time from the regulators. The Federal Grain Inspection Service tightened its pesticide residue rules, raising testing fees by 40%. They mandated that every single shipment had to clear a new, rigorous chemical threshold before it could move abroad. If a load failed mid-route, it risked rejection and millions in costly returns. The system couldn't handle the friction. Barge traffic on the Mississippi River dropped well below the 5-year average. New Orleans, usually the bustling gateway to the world, transformed into a floating warehouse of stagnation. More than 180 vessels sat idle, anchored in the humidity, waiting for inspections, waiting for paperwork, and waiting for scarce empty containers that simply weren't coming. For the growers back in Iowa and Indiana, this delay wasn't just frustrating. It was a financial hemorrhage. Every week that grain sat stuck in transit, it shaved roughly 27 cents off the value of every bushel. That might sound like small change, but when you are moving millions of tons, it is a fortune evaporating into thin air. Operations that had survived droughts and floods found they couldn't survive the waiting game. The grain was darkening in the rain, and farmers watched their revenue wither by the hour. But while the U.S. supply chain was paralyzed by its own bureaucracy and trade wars, international buyers weren't going to wait. They were already looking for a supplier who didn't come with this much baggage. And they found one that was rewriting the rules of the game. As the barges rusted in New Orleans, a far more dangerous reality was taking shape across the negotiating tables of the world. The logistical breakdown was painful, but it was solvable. The next crisis, however, was existential. Global demand was shifting. For decades, the United States operated on a simple principle: grow as much as possible, as fast as possible. Quantity was king. But international buyers were no longer satisfied with grain that was merely abundant. In a post-pandemic world obsessed with health and climate mandates, the new currency was purity. The market demanded grain that was clean, traceable, and increasingly sustainable. America was not ready for this conversation. The shock deepened in February when Mexico, historically one of America's closest and most reliable trading partners, dropped the hammer. The Mexican government implemented a ban on imports of genetically modified corn. It was a stunning geopolitical maneuver that sent tremors through the Chicago Board of Trade. But it didn't stop at the border. International feed mills in Europe and Asia quickly took the cue, beginning to add similar non-GMO and low-chemical residue clauses to their purchase contracts. They weren't just asking for corn, they were asking for a specific kind of corn that the United States simply wasn't growing anymore. This shift caught U.S. producers completely off guard. For the last 30 years, American agriculture has bet the farm on biotechnology. Today, over 90% of the nation's corn acreage is genetically modified to resist pests and herbicides. It is a system designed for yield, not for the nuances of a picky global market. Practically overnight, American grain was erased from the list of preferred suppliers. Imagine the panic. You have millions of tons of harvest sitting in silos, and suddenly, the product you have spent all year growing is legally defined as undesirable by your biggest customers. This wasn't a tariff war that could be negotiated away by diplomats. This was a green wall, a barrier built of environmental standards and consumer fears that no amount of political pressure could breach. The American agricultural machine, built on efficiency and biotech dominance, had become a dinosaur. It was too big to pivot and too reliant on the old ways to adapt. And while U.S. farmers were left scrambling to understand these new rules, a neighbor to the north was watching. Canada hadn't just predicted this shift. They had spent years engineering their entire supply chain to exploit it. While America was arguing about tariffs, Canada was building a digital weapon that would render U.S. corn obsolete. While the American Midwest was paralyzed by confusion and regulatory gridlock, Canada was executing a masterclass in modern trade warfare. They didn't win this market share by accident. They won it through a ruthless, disciplined strategy that had been in the works for years. Canada realized early on that in the 21st century, trust is a currency as valuable as the grain itself. While Washington relied on bulk and muscle, Ottawa bet on data. The centerpiece of this strategy was the Prairie Trace blockchain system. This was the game changer. It allowed Canadian exporters to document every single step of the supply chain, from the seed planted in the ground to the moment the cargo was loaded at the port. When a buyer in Tokyo or Rotterdam purchased Canadian grain, they didn't just get a commodity. They received a digital passport containing verification of origin, chemical clarity, and crucial low-carbon scores. This was exactly what the new global market was starving for. It was a level of transparency that the American bulk system simply could not provide. The results were immediate and devastating for U.S. competitors. Within weeks of the U.S. logistics crisis, Canadian exporters secured long-term, multi-billion-dollar contracts with Japan, South Korea, and the European Union. These buyers were willing to pay a premium for peace of mind. The numbers tell the story of two different economies. While spot corn prices in the American Midwest collapsed to $3.45 per bushel, the lowest in nearly a decade, corn grown in Manitoba was trading at $4.20, plus an additional 20-cent premium for traceability and environmental compliance. Buyers weren't just walking away from the U.S. They were running toward Canada and paying extra for the privilege. The strategic coup de grace came in March 2025. Canada finalized an organic equivalency arrangement with South Korea. This diplomatic victory allowed certified Canadian grain to bypass the additional, time-consuming inspections that were currently strangling U.S. shipments. While American vessels sat idle waiting for clearance, Canadian ships were fast-tracked directly into Korean ports. Behind the scenes, the Canadian government fueled this takeover. Export Development Canada stepped in to offer insurance for single-lot shipments and reimburse costs tied to low-emission transport. Rail routes were aggressively optimized to funnel grain from the prairies to Vancouver efficiently. Some rail lines even picked up stranded U.S. cargo at discounted rates on their return trips, a final insult to the struggling American supply chain. By the time the USDA logged a 14% year-over-year drop in vessel bookings from Gulf ports, the damage was irreversible. Canada had not only stolen the sales, they had stolen the reputation. They positioned themselves as the future-ready source of food security. In the eyes of the world, American corn had become a risky, dirty liability, while Canadian grain was the gold standard. The US was playing a game of volume, but Canada had changed the rules to a game of value. The global shift didn't just hurt the American bottom line, it shattered the backbone of the rural economy. When the contracts were canceled and the barges remained at anchor, the pain flowed upstream, straight to the family farm. By late September, the USDA projected that 2.5 billion bushels of corn, roughly 68 million tons, would remain unsold. The sheer weight of that surplus crushed local markets. In Cedar Rapids, full delivery corn traded at just $3.74 per bushel, a price that sat well below the break-even cost of production. For growers in Iowa carrying input costs of $165 per acre, the math was impossible. They were paying to go to work. Many made the heartbreaking decision to stop harvesting altogether, knowing that burning diesel to collect a worthless crop would only deepen their debt. The fallout was immediate and visible. Combines appeared for sale on roadsides. Farmers who had worked the land for decades took night jobs just to make mortgage payments. Indiana's rural economy began to falter, contracting by over 6% in the first quarter of 2025 alone. But the cruelest irony was found at the local food banks. As funding dried up and surplus grain programs vanished, the Food Bank of Indiana reported a surging demand from a new demographic. Families who had dedicated their lives to feeding the nation found themselves lining up for donated meals. The devastation rippled outward. The ethanol industry, typically a safety valve for surplus corn, buckled under the pressure. 25 plants across the Midwest were idled, sidelining more than 1 billion gallons of output. At Valero's facility in Columbus, Nebraska, shifts were slashed, leaving hundreds of workers without jobs. The entire industrial chain that once turned American corn into wealth was breaking down. What was once the nation's greatest asset had become a heavy burden, dragging down the very towns that depended on it. The consequences reach far beyond corn. Soybeans are the next domino to fall. With over 90% of U.S. acreage genetically modified, they are already flagged for exclusion by European markets. The effects will cascade into dairy and beef, where Canada and Australia are already racing toward net zero standards. Washington now faces a stark binary choice: dismantle the punitive tariff walls and embrace modern traceability, or watch the American agricultural empire crumble under its own weight. The world is moving on. The question is, will America catch up before it's too late? Share your thoughts in the comments below.